Hello, a very good evening. It's 4 minutes past 9 on LBC. I want to spend the next hour talking about football, which is not something that we do very often on LBC, but I think there is there are sort of regulatory implications to this. That's how I'm justifying it. We're not going to be talking about which footballer is the best and all of that. We want to talk about this fan-led review, which Tracey Crouch, the former sports minister, had convened and reported last Thursday. And I thought it was worth looking at some of the conclusions from this, because even if you're not particularly into football, it is our national sport, and it's something that has become such a massive business, a massive cash generator for this country, certainly for the clubs in the Premier League. You look at, I think it was today that we heard that LBC were going to pay $2 billion for the Premier League rights. Well, you multiply that around the world, that is serious money. But is that money trickling down to where it needs to go to, or is too much of it being kept by the Premier League clubs? Well, one of the conclusions from Tracey Crouch's report was that there needs to be a regulator in the world of football, and the regulator would be responsible for all sorts of things. It's been dubbed IREF. Get it? And I want to know what you think about this, and also if you've got questions about this report, or Tracey Crouch is here to answer them over the next hour. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, just tell us the origins of this report, because there's been complaints mainly by fans groups, particularly in the Premier League, that they've been ignored by their respective clubs over the years, that supporting a football club isn't the same as it used to be. They feel as if they've lost their clubs in some ways, and I see this with my own club. I mean, there's various supporters groups think, well, how dare they move to the London Stadium, etc., etc. They're just ignoring all of the fans' concerns. Now, multiply that not just in the Premier League, but I suspect it trickles down as well, and we've seen all sorts of clubs going out of business over the last few years. Macclesfield, Bury, we were talking about a little earlier. What has really driven the agenda for your review?
Well, I think it's important to go back to the starting point and the context for the review. We have seen football clubs that are really important in their local communities go bust. Bury is the most recent example. Macclesfield, Wigan, and others have also occurred, and that was often because concerns that were being raised were not being listened to, and the so-called regulator, i.e. the leagues, were not hearing those concerns and not acting on those concerns. And then all of a sudden, nothing can be done, and the football club goes bust, and its impact on the local community is extraordinary. It's not like when, as a consumer, a bank or a building society goes out of business, or, an energy company, because you can switch those. When you sign up to support a football club, you do so for life, and you can't just switch it off. You can't just sort of you're a West Ham fan, I'm a Tottenham fan. We wouldn't just fall out of love with our club and go and support Arsenal. Right? It just
certainly not.
It just wouldn't happen. So, football is actually really, really important in people's lives. So that was the sort of the first point, and it was in the government's, it was in the Conservative Party's manifesto to have a fan-led review of football. COVID struck. Actually, COVID heightened some of the crisis financially in football. But then the European Super League breakaway attempt earlier this year was the trigger point for the review, where it became apparent that actually a lot of decisions were being driven by money and not by what's best for football or indeed for the fans. And that was the starting point really around the financial sustainability of football, why the leagues or the regulators were not listening to concerns around football, and then obviously the big six kind of attitude towards the rest of the pyramid and actually threatening English football as we know it.
Well, there's so many things to pick up on there. Let's talk about the reaction, because we'll come to your conclusions, because there were 47 of them, and the government say that...
there were 47 detailed ones, there were 10 strategic.
All right, well, maybe we'll come on to the strategic ones in a moment, but what has been the reaction from the world of football?
Well, so I would say from fans, it's been extremely positive. From some parts of football, so the English Football League, the EFL, have actually been quite respectful in their response. I think they recognise that there have been regulatory failings, and whilst that they would prefer to be the regulator, they recognise that there are a lot of things that have happened which are out of their control and getting further out of their control. The Premier League have said that they understand that an independent regulator is something that is being looked at by government and parliament, and they can accept that actually there is some value in that. Certain Premier League clubs have been quite vocal in their opposition, albeit it's interesting that those Premier League clubs that have been vocal in their opposition were previously Championship clubs. Who
let's talk about Leeds United, shall we? Because their chief executive, Angus Kinnear, who used to be at West Ham, he's compared calls for an independent regulator in English football and a transfer levy on Premier League clubs to Maoism and the Great Chinese Famine.
It's slightly extreme response.
And what was he saying when Leeds were in the Championship?
Well, when I had a quick look, and he said that we should be transferring more money down the pyramid, and that parachute payments distort competition. And
just remind us where Leeds are on the table at the moment.
I think they're at the moment, depending on whether they win tonight, they're just above the relegation zone. So they're just 1 or 2 games away from finding themselves back in the Championship, where presumably they will be the recipient of parachute payments, which were once considered to be distorting competition. But hey, look, chairmen and owners and chief executives of football clubs are entitled to their view on the review.
But is that a view that is commonly shared?
I don't think so.
Among other Premier League clubs?
No, I don't think so. I think there's mixed views on it. Okay, I think and I think one of the reasons why the Premier League is it has been sort of kind of lukewarm in its response is that it can't be completely hostile, and it can't be completely for it, because it represents 20 different clubs, and actually therein lies the reason why there needs to be an independent regulator, because it's very, very difficult for the Premier League to speak in one sort of kind of coordinated voice. There's either claims that it is only the voice of the Big Six, and the Big Six are, ruling the roost over the rest of the Premier League, or there's other claims that the other 14 are, ruling the Premier League over the Big Six.
Just for clarification, given that West Ham are 4th, do they qualify as Big Six?
Technically, no. My officials that were working with me on the report thought it was hilarious to describe the Big Six as the Big 5 plus Tottenham. But
let me play devil's advocate for a second here, because isn't it a fundamentally unconservative thing to want to interfere with the free market here? That you want to introduce regulation where some people say, look, the Premier League is as successful as it is because it has been free of regulation all of these years. Only
somebody who doesn't understand what is being proposed would think that we are interfering in free market, because actually it's quite the opposite. If you look at the recommendations as a whole, and perhaps this is a sort of kind of useful point to look at the recommendations, it's not just about a regulator, it's also about financial regulation. And what we've discovered, I think, in football over perhaps potentially the last decade is some of the arrogance that crept into the banking sector about being too big to fail has crept into football. And, we've seen, and we wrote about it at length in the report, owners chasing dreams, pumping in money that they don't have, gambling with their football club, and that ending up in a very, in a disastrous situation. And so, what we're actually trying to do is create regulation that enables people to be able to grow and invest and expand, but to do so sensibly. And that's what happens in almost every other sector. Football is one of the last self-regulated sectors, and some of the regulation, the financial regulation in particular that we're looking at, or that's rather that we proposed, is now being considered, for example, by the energy sector. So we're looking at capital and liquidity. It's really, really sort of kind of technical and complex. But actually, from a football perspective, it makes sense. No more can owners come in and buy a club for £1 and then gamble, with things that they don't have, leaving a community completely bereft of any kind of, club to support. So, it's not just a case of, we're setting up an independent regulator and we're going to tell, football how it's going to operate. That's not quite what it's about. But actually, there are some flaws in the way football is run.
Do you think there's been a failure by not just the Football Association, the FA, but also by UEFA and FIFA here? Because they have introduced financial fair play regulations about you can't sign any more players if your wage bill exceeds X, Y or Z. So
only for those that are in their competition.
Well, indeed. But they've made a start, but that was, 10 or 15 years ago. Nothing has happened since then. Why do you think that is?
Well, the powerful vested interests, actually, is the answer to that. And I think that is one of the arguments for independence. We've actually stayed in touch with FIFA and UEFA throughout this process. UEFA, I think in particular, are quite interested in some of the recommendations being put forward. But from a holistic perspective, and I think this is the important thing, is that, yes, of course, there's focus on the establishment of an independent regulator. I completely understand that. But there are other recommendations around good corporate governance, for example. It's extraordinary. There's a number of football clubs in the pyramid that don't have a board. Right? You have one person who's the chair and the chief executive of a football club, which is a business. Right? And I can't think of any other business other than a small, perhaps, self-employed kind of business where you would have no board. And so as a consequence, there's no accountability in any of the decisions that are being made. So I don't think what we've proposed in terms of good corporate governance is particularly radical or Maoist.
So let's say that most of your proposals are actually implemented. How different will football be in 10 years' time to what it is now? Because that's got to be the test, hasn't it? What changes?
I think it will be sustainable. I think it will be... Well, one of the things around financial regulation is that shocks can be buffered. And if you've got real-time financial monitoring, which actually many of the clubs completely favour, you can help kind of make sure that a club doesn't get into a Derby or a Bury situation, because you have the ability for a financial regulator to be able to look there and support and advise and help people through these various crises, whatever they might be.
Well, if you think Tracey Crouch is a Maoist, Angus Kinnear, you might like to give us a call. If you work in the world of football, if you're an ex-footballer, if you're a fan, this is meant to be, well, it was a fan-led review. So we'd like to hear from you. If you are a fan, how do you think these proposals would affect your team? And do you feel effectively disenfranchised from football at the moment because of maybe the high-handed attitude of the club that you've supported all your life? 0345 6060 973. 16 minutes past 9.
LBC Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 19 minutes past 9. Tracey Crouch is here talking about her fan-led football review and the conclusions and recommendations. We'll come on to more of them in just a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to talk to Tracey about the review or put a question, or maybe you've got a comment on some of the conclusions. Shuvik is in Eltham. Hello, Shuvik.
Hello to Ian and Tracey. I'd like to ask a question about something that is increasingly referred to as sports washing. It's the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund's purchase of Newcastle United Football Club. What does Tracey Crouch think of the purchase, and would cases like this come under the jurisdiction of the new regulator?
That's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because if the regulator had been in place, I mean, this deal had been going on for quite some time, and I think it had been turned down, hadn't it? Or the FA had come out against it. They must have changed their minds. How would this have been different if your regulator had been in place?
It's a really good question, and I was asked quite a lot about this last week. The new review... the new regulations in the review basically add good character to the owners and directors test. It's not necessarily the case that with the new test that the Newcastle deal would have been turned down, and actually it's really difficult for me to say either way because I haven't seen the details of the Newcastle takeover, but it would have stress tested it more, and it would have been more transparent. And one of the criticisms that has been had against the Premier League is that they couldn't. That there wasn't a transparent process, and everybody was getting fed up with it. So the fans of Newcastle didn't know what was going on. See bits and pieces here and there, but ultimately at the end of the day, they weren't able to sort of kind of talk about it. But when you've got a very transparent process, and the character test, which is the character test that is used in the banking, securities and insurance industry, is being applied, I think it would have stressed it more. Whether or not it would have turned it down, I don't know the answer to that. But it's really difficult, I mean, because the Premier League say that they've had assurances, legal assurances, that it's not the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that is taking over Newcastle. I don't know those legal details, but they're the current regulator that applies.
It is quite difficult, isn't it? Because if you just say, well, they come from Saudi Arabia, therefore they must be bad because the Saudi Arabian regime has done bad things in the past. I mean, that surely isn't the way to decide who should own a football club. If that were the case, I mean, there are plenty of countries around the world that we could say, well, sorry, we don't want anybody from those countries.
Yeah, what I find extraordinary as well, and I'm not to kind of saying either way whether or not I personally think that this test would have made any difference at all. But PIF, the fund that now owns Newcastle, they also own Disney, and people don't seem to be concerned that Pocahontas is now owned by the Saudis. They own Facebook, and people are going onto Facebook to complain about the Saudi takeover of Newcastle, and I'm just thinking that's sort of kind of slightly bizarre, but or rather they have a significant stake in it. So I just think that football is incredibly special, and it's important that we have protections in place, and it's important that we recognise the importance of football in communities. But we can also use football, I think, to change behaviours, and we can change minds on issues. Previous Prime Minister Theresa May was in Saudi Arabia on an official visit, and one of the actions from that visit was to send me to Saudi Arabia.
What had you done?
To talk about women's sport. And I'll be honest, I actually tried quite a lot of things to get out of that trip, including not telling my private office that my passport had run out. But annoyingly, my my private offices were extremely efficient. But actually, do you know what?
Come on, tell us about the trip then.
Well, I played football with girls in Saudi Arabia.
Because you're a qualified FA coach, aren't you?
Coach, yeah. And I played football with girls, and I talked about women being allowed to go into stadiums, and now they're allowed to go into stadiums. And I'm not saying that, this is what makes everything in Saudi Arabia okay, but, I felt that despite my internal opposition to visiting Saudi Arabia, I felt that just I'd achieved a small amount by going, and to play to play football with girls. And a couple of weeks ago, and I took a picture actually of it. There was a picture in the Times a couple of weeks ago of a Saudi national football player playing in one of the national football stadiums, which they weren't allowed to do previously. So, actually football can help in terms of...
See, that is why doing this sort of hour, I think, is important, because football actually is important to people who aren't football fans, even if they don't know it, isn't it? Because if a football club plays it right and it really is enmeshed in the community, it's a really important thing. It's just as important as the biggest employer in the area, probably.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, it doesn't matter what level of football you're in, whether you're, grassroots football, like, I take my son to on a Saturday morning, through to a Premier League club. Your role in the community is essential. And it's taken me a long time as a politician to persuade people of why football is important, because I think a lot of politicians who don't know and love football like you and I do, Ian, actually just think of football as 90 minutes, bunch of mainly men running around, kicking lumps out of each other. Actually, I think the ESL and Bury showed that football is more important than that. And when Bury disappeared, and people, grown men, were kind of crying openly, not just because their football club had declined, but actually because of the impact economically on the community. I think that's when people start to realise that actually football is really important. And COVID as well, right? Football clubs were out there again, regardless of where you are in the pyramid. Chatham Town was out ringing its elderly supporters on a regular basis. It was taking food to people that they knew were housebound and unable to get out, as were Spurs, as were West Ham. So actually, I think football is more important than just the 90 minutes that you and I go and cheer or jeer.
Shuvik, let's come back to you. What do you make of the situation with Newcastle?
I don't think that the problems in Saudi Arabia are in the past. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi was only a few years ago. I think it was a couple of years ago, and the war in Yemen, which Saudi Arabia is involved, Iran is involved as well, is going on at the moment, and it's one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. A lot of British NGOs are involved in helping with the situation in Yemen. So it's particularly a matter of concern. This is a sovereign wealth fund as well. Because of those factors, it is particularly of concern that that Newcastle United will be majority owned by this sovereign wealth fund.
But what about if a Chinese consortium wanted to buy a British club? Well, exactly.
Yeah. Well, there is actually already a Chinese. I'm desperately trying to wrap my brain. Wolves?
I can't
remember. There's definitely...
It is Wolves, apparently.
Get me with my football.
Done.
I should be chair of the football review.
But, you've got all of the Uyghur genocide in China. Are we supposed to ban all Chinese ownership of British clubs because we disapprove of what the Chinese government does? I'm sure there is a case for that.
We've got obviously a Russian... although obviously he's switched nationality now, but Abramovich obviously involved in Chelsea. We've got a British Iranian in Everton. We've got ties in Leicester.
Yep. And now a Czech in West Ham.
So I completely understand people's concerns, but
But football is a global game, and you're never going to be able to stop that. We're never going to go back to the days when all British football clubs were owned by British people or British companies, and in my view, nor should we. Well, it's so much to talk about. Shuvik, thank you very much indeed. I want to talk a bit about how the money isn't cascading down the football period and what your review can do to change that. And we'll hopefully take some more of your calls. 0345 6060 973. It's 9:30 on LBC. Lucinda Horsley has the news headlines.
Boris Johnson says the government's taking balanced and proportionate measures as it adapts to the new Omicron COVID variant. The Prime Minister insists there's no need to cancel Christmas parties or nativity plays. 3 students have died after a shooting at a high school in the US. It happened in Michigan earlier today. A 15-year-old was arrested and a handgun was recovered by police. People in Scotland and North East England say they're exhausted and heartbroken after a 5th day without power. Around 45,000 people are still affected after Storm Arwen damaged electricity lines on Friday. LBC weather, a mostly dry, cloudy but mild and breezy evening. Rain spreading in from the west overnight, which will be heavy at times, a low of 8 degrees.
LBC. If you're leading Britain's conversation, Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
9:33 on LBC. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to talk to Tracey Review about her Tracey Crouch about her review into the future of football. Karina is in Newham. Hello, Karina.
Hi.
Hello. Now, living in Newham, I hope you're a West Ham supporter.
I'm not, no.
Oh, no.
My great-granddad used to work over the Woolwich Arsenal, so my blood is red. I'm an Arsenal supporter through and through.
Oh dear.
Sorry to hear that, Karina.
We'll still let you continue, though. What would you like to tell us, Karina?
Well, I was just saying that the sponsorships do make a difference. When I was a child, there was no football, nothing for girls at all. And my daughters just started playing for the local team that just train on a Saturday. And now they've got sponsorship from a local estate agent. So, when I was younger, that would never have happened at all. And it makes a huge difference around here to have that sort of support as well.
And you say it's made a difference. Just go into that a little bit.
So she'll get her football kits paid for. She'll get they'll pay the fees to be able to start leagues and to be able to progress, basically. And it's something that was never available when we was younger.
It's really important in grassroots football for businesses to get involved and to support their local club, because actually a couple of £100 from local estate agent, or whatever, it's not a lot, but for the football club it's enormous. And I remember when I was involved in a girls team in Chatham, the chair and the secretary of the club used to spend an extraordinary huge amount of time just trying to get money to pay for shirts, for trophies at the end of the season. And actually also because it was Chatham, there were quite a few kids that couldn't necessarily afford the club fees, and so there was an opportunity as well to support people who wanted to play football but couldn't afford to play football. From the majority of us, we don't think anything of £3, but actually for some people that's an enormous amount, the money that they just can't afford to spend. Thank you to your local estate agents for supporting Grassroots.
And where you live, Karina, I mean, I know the area reasonably well. It's majority non-white, and I've always wondered why, for example, when I first started going to West Ham as a season ticket holder in the early 90s, I was constantly astonished at how few brown faces there were in the crowd. That's less the case now, but it's still there still seems to be a resistance, and I wonder why that would be.
I would say it's age, because that grows out with age. It grows out. I grew up I went to school and I was the only white person in my school, but all those people are the same as me. Do you know what I mean? And it grows out. It will grow out. It will grow out. There's not many Asians at all in football. And I hate it when people say that Asians can't play football, because it's just not true. They can. Yeah. It's just that they're not promoted within the sport. And especially living around here, to have a girls' football team, the message that it sends, it is progress. That's the big part of it for me, is progress, especially in a predominantly Muslim community, because it is different, So to have a girls' football team, it's promoting females to be able to have the sport in the same way, it's progress. It is progress.
Karina, thank you very much indeed for your call. Let's look at the progress of equality issues and diversity issues in football, because you've talked about that in your review. Just take us through a couple of the recommendations that you've come up with. So
equality, diversity and inclusion actually ended up being quite a key running theme from fans who contributed to the review. And I should just say, actually, you said about it being fan-led, we had 130 clubs or representatives from 130 clubs give evidence. We took over 100 hours of evidence. We had 20,000 fans respond to the surveys. So really the recommendations are firmly built on what they were saying to us. But EDI issues, equality, diversity, inclusion issues, came up throughout. And they were in different parts. So, part of it was about the lack of EDI visible in the game, in the running of the game. But also, how can we kind of change attitudes to some of the issues around EDI? And again, it goes back to what we're talking about, the power of football. And actually, Karina, was it just then?
Yep.
Was saying about it, and it's about role models. Right? And so actually, if you have more people from a diverse background involved in the running of football, then it will encourage more people to get involved.
And in terms of, that's slightly motherhood and apple pie, though, because everyone can think that's a good idea, but how do you actually bring it about? So
we've put in a recommendation around clubs having EDI action plans. So the authorities themselves have EDI action plans, the Football Association, the Premier League, the EFL. They're not necessarily mandatory. throughout the pyramid, and therefore what we want to see is that being part of a licence that is given to a football club to address the issues around EDI. It's important to their fan base. Their fans feel really strongly about it, because actually, Karina is quite right. It's an age thing, and actually, as the age of football fans is changing, their attitudes towards certain issues are changing, and so they want to see better representation around these issues.
What about fan tokens?
What's a fan token? What do you mean?
Well, they're apparently, I'm informed here, fan tokens are a form of cryptocurrency that give holders access to a variety of fan-related membership perks like voting on club decisions, rewards, merchandise designs, and other sort of unique experiences.
Okay, look,
I've never heard of that.
No, and also cryptocurrency is not one of my areas of expertise.
In terms of the gambling sector, because obviously a lot of clubs, mine included, have gambling companies associated with them in terms of shirt sponsorship. Did you look into that?
Not specifically.
Given your background in gambling and slot machines.
So it wasn't specifically part of the review, but again, fans were proactively raising their concerns about it. In fact, actually, we heard from one Derby fan, for example, who said that he refuses to wear his club shirt going around the town because he didn't want children seeing a betting sponsor. And so fans were raising it with us. In the interim report, I made a recommendation that government, who are doing a gambling review separate to this, met with football fans specifically to hear their concerns about the link between gambling companies and football. My understanding is that they have now had this meeting, and of course the gambling review is due out, I think, at the beginning of next year. So it was separate, but it would have been remiss of us to have completely ignored it, given the fact that fans were raising it with us.
But personally, what do you think about the future of gambling sponsorships in football?
It's really difficult, and I've said this to gambling charities and anti-gambling advocates in the past. Betting companies do bring in significant money into football, which in turn goes into the development of grassroots. So it is hard to sort of accept that if, for example, you took advertising completely away from a football company, that would limit some of their own investment into other parts of the pyramid. That said, I think it's become particularly evasive, and it is clear that a lot of people have concerns about it. I'm not anti-gambling at all, and don't get me wrong, I place bets on football as well, but I don't like seeing it all over the place. You're smart.
Well, I'm silent because I don't. I don't know.
I'm just not a hypocrite, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that gambling in football is all bad when I put bets on football. But I don't like seeing non-stop gambling advertising when I'm either in a football ground, watching football, and so on. And I do think the impact on children can be quite harmful.
0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask Tracey Crouch a question about her review. Let's talk a little bit more about women's football, because you've been a great advocate of that. Probably, I would say, the biggest advocate of anybody in public life that I know. And you and I have had some fairly amusing exchanges on the subject over the years, but it has become a big thing now. It's still not getting massive crowds, though. It's not nowhere near the level of the men's game on that. But do you think it is right that, for example, the broadcasters are now taking women's football really seriously? Usually there seems to be a female football pundit or commentator involved in a game. Some men feel slightly uncomfortable about that for various reasons, I suppose. But you're never going to get the women's game up to the level of the men's if there isn't some sort of effectively positive discrimination, are you?
Well, I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve. I mean, actually, women's football is growing enormously, and credit where it is due. The Football Association has done an enormous amount to support women's football. So has the Premier League. So have Premier League clubs who have invested in their own teams. Clubs throughout the pyramid, are now trying to make sure that they have a women's team. Broadcasters are doing their bit. Sponsors are beginning to do their bit. Actually, we are seeing crowds grow at women's football. And from a broadcasting perspective, I'm sure I read a statistic somewhere that said that basically women's football is watched more than the Scottish Premier League. So, I think that, there is growth there.
Happy St Andrew's Day, by the
way. You made me lose my train of thought. But in the review, we looked at women's football specifically, and we came to the conclusion that women's football needed its own review, not because there's necessarily significant things wrong with women's football, in the same way that some of the reason behind what we're looking at the men's professional game was around the flaws of men's football, but actually because it is growing quickly, didn't want it to start making the same mistakes that we've seen in men's football. But also there was quite a healthy discussion from fans about whether or not women's football should be completely separate to men's football. Because at the moment, obviously, the women's teams are affiliated with the men's teams. Did they want to be completely separate to that and have its own sponsorship and try and sort of kind of work its way on its own? And that was really quite an interesting kind of pushback. Not everyone agreed with it. So that's why we thought, right, okay, we have to focus on the core remit of this particular review. And so that's why we recommended a separate review for women's football.
The England women's team beat Latvia 20-0 this evening. Now, you could say, well, that's brilliant, isn't it? But it will lend credence to those who think, well, the women's football game is not quite where it needs to be if scores like that are happening.
But it happens sometimes in men's football as well, right? And, I have to say, I have been a manager of games where girls have thrashed other teams. I've also been a player where I've been on the losing side of a thrashing. So, it happens, but it also happens in the men's game. Maybe not 20-0, but I'm sure there are pretty eye-watering scores.
Rex in East Grinstead says, Tracey Crouch is a wonderful interviewee with you and Nick Ferrari. Did you betray me the other day? Her football knowledge and passion and overall integrity is a joy to behold. Congratulations for a super programme. Thank you very much. I'm going to give Tracey a couple of minutes to think about this one. Tony has texted, I would like Tracey's view of financial fair play. My club Derby is on the brink of not existing through the actions of a previous owner. Why should a club that's existed for almost 140 years not exist because of mismanagement of one owner? Well, we kind of did cover that a bit at the beginning.
I don't need a couple of minutes for that, unless you needed to go to an advert break.
Because we do need to go to a break. 9:47.
Coming up at 10 on LBC, Tom Swarbrick.
Oh, Jenny, should you be cancelling unnecessary social events? Are schools right to be stopping nativity plays? Will the Christmas party be jettisoned? What was Jenny Harries trying to say?
Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
10 to 10, we have Tracey Crouch with us talking about her football review. We were talking about Tony, who wants to know about why... is it called financial fair play? Just explain what that is.
Well, actually, in the Championship and below, it's profit and sustainability. So kind of there's different rules and everything else. But actually, we were looking... one of the reasons why we have introduced... or recommended rather for introduction and a brand new system is that it's just not working, right? And there are so many flaws. And funny enough, Tony, I feel for you at the moment. I've very fond memories of Derby being in my Panini sticker album, which is how I base my love for most of my football clubs.
Isn't that funny? Because I remember you're too young for this, but in 1971, I think, Esso, if you bought 4 gallons of petrol, you got a football club crest. You stuck it in this little album, and that's why I support Dunfermline Athletic in Scotland, because they had the most lovely triangular football badge. That's
hilarious. But seriously, my early 80s, mid 80s football clubs, you got sort of kind of Derby, Leyton Orient. And anyway, we digress. We spoke to Mel Morris as part of
he's the chairman
review.
of Derby, or the owner of Derby.
And Mel, I feel sorry actually in a way, because Mel is exactly the kind of person that you should want in football. He grew up in Derby, supported the club his whole entire life. He's wanted to invest in it, and it's just all gone wrong. And it's gone wrong for a variety of reasons, chasing dreams that they couldn't afford in a league where parachute payments distort competition, and so on. And we specifically asked him if the recommendations that we were at that point minded to put in front of government were in place, including real-time financial monitoring. Did he think that his club would be in a different position? And he said yes, right? So, and I just kind of hope that we can introduce the recommendations and get them in place before we see another Derby teetering on the brink of disaster. Because it's heartbreaking.
Talking of Derby, we have Gareth in Matlock in Derbyshire. Hello, Gareth.
Good evening. Nice to speak to you, Tracey. It's really fabulous to get the opportunity to speak to you, because I am a Derby County supporter. I'm old enough to remember watching them win 2 league championships. I was very young the first time, but 1972 and 1975. I also saw England in Italy in 1990, and that was just before the Premier League was formed. And I didn't like it then, and I don't like it now. The thing is, if you want financial fair play back in football, and you want a pyramid back, the only way to do that is stop this silly system where the Premier League and the EFL are separated. You can't have a situation where 90% of the money goes to 20 teams, 10% filters down to the other 72. Football was better when Wimbledon could start in the 4th division, and they nearly actually have got right to the top like Derby did. And that can't happen now. Mel Morris did try, and he spent all his money, has left Derby in a dreadful position, but the fact is, as you said, with these parachute payments, it's totally impossible. I mean, is it Trevor Birch wants to have championship clubs running by their own means? But how can you possibly compete? There's teams like Derby, Nottingham Forest, Sunderland, Bolton, teams like that, good old-fashioned teams who haven't got a hope. The hope's been taken away.
Yeah, but people said that. People would have said, hang on, Gareth. People would have said that about Leicester City not so long ago.
I agree about that. That is a one-off. But don't forget, a lot of money's gone into Leicester. I think it's money from abroad, and this generally isn't happening. I mean, you just can't have this situation continue. And I think the FA themselves are partly to blame here, because they're supposed to be the top governance in football. When UEFA look at England, they look at the FA and they're supposed to be in charge, but they've allowed the Premier League. And, I've heard since this discussion's been talking about this fans-led review, I've heard quite a lot of representatives and sort of CEOs of Premier League coming on the radio. And they're obviously not very happy about this, because they know the eventual aim is to take more money off them, and that's good. But it needs to be done properly. We need to bring the pyramid back. We need to bring 4 divisions back, and the money needs to be split.
Listen, Gareth, we've only got a few minutes left, so let me put that point to Tracey. He's absolutely right, isn't he, about the pyramid? Because, OK, you've got the 4 divisions, but it's almost impossible nowadays for somebody to... I mean, I remember in the 1970s, Carlisle, Swansea, they went from 4th division to the 1st division. I think they both went back very quickly. But that's so much more difficult.
Yeah, my mate Andy will be thrilled that Wimbledon were mentioned then. But look, I mean, let me start by saying not everything is bad about the Premier League. Not everything is bad about English football. First of all, we have one of the most successful, not one of the most, we have the most successful elite competition in football. We have actually a competitive football league, despite what people might think. You only have to look at Germany and Spain and Italy to see that actually our leagues is way more competitive than theirs. We have the deepest pyramid in football in the world, and we have the most lucrative leagues in the world. Our championship is still worth more, I think, than Spain and France potentially. I can't remember which it was, but anyway, our championship is still lucrative. Where the problem is actually the flow of that money through the pyramid, and you had Niall Cooper on for Fair Game earlier, making the point that I think half of, or a significant chunk of Premier League money that flows through the pyramid actually goes on parachute payments. So little beyond that goes into the rest of the Football League. And there is a significant difference in the wealth of the Premier League to the Championship, and yet, you could actually, fund through the Premier League most of the rest of the football pyramid. What I want to do in this report is, if you have better governance in place to ensure that actually you don't have poor financial decisions being made by owners that aren't being held accountable by her board, for example, then the Premier League should have confidence in getting more money through the pyramid. I completely accept at the moment they might not want to give more money to clubs like Derby, for example, because they're giving good money into a bad business. No offence, Tony and co from Derby. But why should they give that money? But if you have better governance and you have better regulation, then they can do so with confidence, and that's all we're saying.
Hugh in Battersea says, Iain, is Tracey related to Peter Crouch, and can she do the robot dance?
I'm not related to Peter, no, but we met recently at an event at Dulwich and we had a good old laugh about it.
Have you enjoyed the experience of doing this?
Yeah. I mean, I genuinely love football. I don't want to do anything that I think is going to damage English football, and I don't think I recommend anything that does damage English football. In fact, actually, I think I do something that creates a long-term financially sustainable structure for football. I think it will encourage investors. I think it can create extra growth. I think it will drive revenue into the grassroots, which, let's be frank, is where all our Premier League players start. So I'm confident that I've done a good job.
And Tracey, thank you very much indeed. You've done a good job over the last hour. We're delighted to have you in the studio with us.